this lesson is going to be a little bit of a throwback to some of the concepts that you learned in chemistry. So remember, our cells are made out of all different kinds of chemicals, and you need to understand a little bit of the basic chemistry concepts that you've learned in the past in order to understand cell reactions and cell processes. So for starters, we are actually made out of just 4 main elements, and those are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. An easy way to remember is just to think CHON. Water, if you recall, is just H2O, right? 2 hydrogens and an oxygen. So this is where the H and the O, or at least one of the places that the H and the O are coming from, is that we're like 70% water. But in addition to that, we're made out of these organic compounds, which are compounds that contain carbon, and that includes things like carbohydrates, fats or lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. And those all contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Additionally, proteins contain nitrogen and sulfur, and nucleic acids contain nitrogen and phosphorus. For now, you don't need to focus on the phosphorus and the sulfur. It's kind of a little preview of something we're going to be talking about in our biochemistry chapter. But if you can remember CHON for now, that would be very helpful. So a little bit of a review of bonding. So a compound is a combination of 2 or more different elements in exact proportions. So for example, water would be a compound. It's always 2 H's and an O. Sodium chloride would be a compound. Glucose, C6H12O6, that would be a compound. Now one thing that would not be a compound would be, for example, O2 or H2. Even though these are composed of more than one atom, they're composed of 2 of the same type of atom. And so they would be a molecule, which is sort of our building block of compounds, but they would not actually be a compound. So I wanted to clarify that. Also, if you are somebody who really remembers your chemistry, you may know that ionic compounds, they're not actually called molecules, they're building blocks, because ionic compounds technically at room temperature are all crystalline solids. So we actually use the term formula units for their smallest whole number ratio. But for purposes of AP Bio, we're just going to say that compounds are made of molecules. So you can just use that as kind of a blanket term, even though technically it's a little bit off if we wanted to get, very, very specific. Now, one concept that you really need to remember from chemistry is the concept of electronegativity. So you may remember, and maybe you don't, learning about trends on the periodic table and how electronegativity, which was one of those trends, it increases to the right, it decreases as you go down. It is kind of a measure of how much an atom wants to take electrons from other atoms. That's kind of the simple way to remember it. So in fact, noble gases, if you remember, these over here at the end, helium and all of those, they actually don't even have an electronegativity because they're very, very happy with themselves, so they're not interested in taking electrons or giving them away. On the other hand, elements over here, like your halogens, like fluorine and chlorine, they have very, very high electronegativities because they're so close to having 8 electrons in their outer shell, and they just need 1 more. So they are very, very interested in stealing electrons from other things, and so they have a very high electronegativity. On the other side of the table, you have your metals. They're not that interested in holding on to electrons. They're actually okay a lot of times giving electrons away, so they tend to have a very low electronegativity. You don't have to memorize the electronegativities from a periodic table or anything like that. What you do need to understand is how electronegativity affects what kind of bonds are going to form between atoms. So in the case of atoms that have very, very similar electronegativities, you're going to get a covalent bond. Because what's going to happen is each atom is going to have exactly the same pull, or a very, very close to the same pull on the electrons. So neither one is really going to have the power to take electrons from the other. It's almost like a tug of war that nobody can win. And so instead, they're going to share electrons. The other extreme is ionic compounds. And this is where one atom has a very, very high electronegativity, and the other one has a very low electronegativity. So the one with high electronegativity has the ability to steal an electron or 2 from the one with the lower electronegativity. And when that happens, the opposite charges hold them together, and that's an ionic bond. But it's it's not really this black and white cutoff that you're either just purely covalent or you're purely ionic. In reality, there's kind of this whole center section here, and that's something called polar covalent, which is spelled wrong there. It's really bothering me. So we're going to kind of look at each of these three. So first, covalent bonding. So if the electronegativities between two elements are similar, as I mentioned, then the outer electrons will be shared with each other. Now, why is this important? Well, it turns out pretty much every molecule in your body that's part of your bodily structures, proteins, carbs, fats, DNA, and even water, all of these things are covalent compounds. They are all involved with electrons being shared. These are usually nonmetals because, again, you don't have to know why, but remember, electronegativity, it increases as you go across. So everything over here, these electronegativities on the periodic table, this is our periodic table, are going to probably be very similar. On the other side of the table, the electronegativity is much, much lower. These are going to be your metals, and so these things are not going to tend to share electrons because one has a much higher electronegativity than the other. All right, let's talk about the middle ground here. So we have sharing, like pure, perfect sharing, and then we have what's called a polar covalent bond. So polar covalent bonds are where there's sharing, but the sharing is due to an uneven electronegativity. It's an uneven sharing. And water is an excellent example of this. So if you remember water from chemistry class, you may remember oxygen originally has 6 electrons and each hydrogen has 1. So what ends up happening is you end up with one shared pair here and a shared pair here, but then oxygen has these 2 lone pairs. Because there's so many electrons around oxygen and electrons themselves are negative, the oxygen is going to get what we call a partial negative charge. This little symbol here, it means partial. So you don't actually write like a full-blown plus or minus on these because that would imply that it's an ionic attraction. Instead, we write these partial charges. It basically just means there's a slight negative on the oxygen because the electrons are sort of hanging around it more. And then there's a slight positive on the hydrogens because the electrons are hanging around it less. But they are still sharing. Sometimes I give the scenario of if you think of it as me sharing a candy bar with you. If you and I share a candy bar and I break it in half and I eat half and I give you exactly half, that would be like a non-polar covalent bond, like a perfect sharing. On the other hand, let's say that I break off a little piece off the end and give you that and I eat the rest. Now we still shared, but I'm kind of like oxygen. I sort of hogged most of the candy bar for myself and I gave you a little bit. The third option here is an ionic compound. So what's happening in an ionic compound would be like I basically steal your candy bar and I refuse to give it back to you and you stick to me and you don't want to leave because there's this attraction of you missing your candy bar and I have your candy bar. So in this case, in an ionic compound, usually it's a metal and a non-metal. One of them, the one with the higher electronegativity, just full out steals an electron from the other one. This one ends up with a negative charge. The one that it took it from ends up with a positive charge. And you may remember doing like a crisscross to get certain ionic formulas. When they're solids, we don't write the charges. But when they're important in biology is when we dissolve them in water. Because when we dissolve an ionic compound, it becomes charged ions. And although we're not made of ionic compounds, like muscle is not made of ionic compounds or cell membranes, but they are, these ions, super important for chemical reactions. So I listed a couple of examples here. So for example, sodium and chloride are really important in transport across, pumping things across cell membranes. Sodium and potassium are also very important in nerve impulse traveling in your body. So from the brain down the spinal cord out to the nerves in your hands and your feet. Calcium is super important in muscle contraction, and it's also involved in breaking glycogen into glucose when you need energy. Potassium ions are actually involved in blood clotting. So these electrolytes, which are, it's just a fancy name for these charged ions in your body, and you don't have to know any specific ones right now, these are going to be very, very important, but not in the same way that covalent compounds are. So your covalent compounds are going to form a lot of your structures. these ionic compounds are going to break into ions, which are then going to be very important in chemical reactions. All right, now one thing that I know sometimes they don't talk too much about in honors chemistry, in AP you talk a lot more about it, are what are called IMFs, or intermolecular forces. So these are attractions that are in between molecules. So if you've ever thought about it, remember, water, H2O, is a single molecule. And then you have a second water. Why is it that water is a liquid? Why don't these individual molecules just float away and become gases? So intermolecular forces are extremely important in causing molecules to stick to each other, not reacting with each other, but just being attracted to each other in such a way that we can have covalent compounds that are liquids and solids. Otherwise, they'd all be gases. So that's why IMFs are important. They will also determine if two liquids will mix together. So for example, oil and water, why don't they mix? Well, oil is nonpolar, and it has IMFs, attractions to other nonpolar oil molecules. But water, on the other hand, is polar. And so it's only attracted to other things that either have partial charges, like water does, or full-blown charges, like ionic compounds. It won't dissolve oil. And so those differences in those IMFs will determine whether liquids will mix together. All right, so the strongest of the IMFs, because there are different ones, but the only one we're going to talk about in here is hydrogen bonds. This is the one that's really important in biology. So this is specifically between hydrogen of one molecule and then nitrogen, fluorine, or oxygen of a second molecule. So for example, right here in this water at the bottom, this is a polar covalent bond. That's not a hydrogen bond. This is an actual molecule. But the attractions between the molecules, which we always represent as dotted lines, those are our hydrogen bonds. And they're the only bond we represent with dotted lines. Besides water, another place we see them, DNA. If you remember A connecting to T and G connecting to C in DNA, if you remember your biology from previous years, those are hydrogen bonds. That's why DNA can unzip so easily to make copies of itself. And a third place where you may not have heard about it being before, but these bonds are very important in the folding up of proteins in our body. And that includes enzymes and hormones and all kinds of proteins that form structures. And the one thing about these hydrogen bonds, because they are technically just strong attractions and very weak, they can break very easily. So this is one of the reasons why having a high fever is very dangerous. If you go to the hospital and you have a fever of like 106, they're going to put you on ice immediately, because when these hydrogen bonds break, they're going to basically stop enzymes and hormones and all kinds of things from working properly, and you could end up with muscle damage or brain damage. And so it's extremely important to maintain a normal body temperature, because these hydrogen bonds can be very delicate. All right. So in our next lecture, we're going to jump into a little more detail about the structure of water. But in this last slide, just a couple quick reminders. So water is it's actually a bent structure. I believe 104.5 is the actual bond angle. You don't have to know that. But make sure that you do know that the oxygen is the more electronegative. The hydrogen is much less electronegative. This is going to be a polar covalent bond here and here within a water. And then these dotted lines, these are the attractions, the hydrogen bonds between the water molecules. And because of this very unique structure, oh, and of course the partial charges. Don't forget, the hydrogen is the slightly positive part, and then the oxygen is the partial negative part. And each water can actually bond to 4 more water molecules, which it says right here. So in our next lecture, we're going to go through some of the specific properties of water that make it so unique and important to life on Earth.